Welcome to my talk, the Neuropolitical Social Contract. A warm hello and welcome to all Nu Rho Psi members and anybody else who's listening. I will be speaking today about the social contract. I will start first speaking about epistemology. So basically, how did I come to this interdisciplinary approach of looking at the political world in a neuropolitical way? Why did I include the brain reality, as I call it, and why is it important? This is kind of connected to the last point of my talk, which is science communication, because the many political and social scientists and people in the humanities, people from public policy, and many others that I have spoken to over the years, people in these different fields were often interested in the brain reality. But many of them were also skeptical. And I have encountered quite some resistance amongst non-neuroscientists and even some neuroscientists who are not social neuroscientists, but work on a more molecular level, on a more micro level. There's been a resistance about this approach, bringing the brain into politics, so to speak. And so I will be speaking about, what is this approach? And then how can we communicate this approach? And why is there resistance? And what are the criticisms and objections that you would commonly get when you try to bring the brain into politics? And all of this is very much connected to the question of what do we actually want from brain data? So I always argue that the brain data is not ontological, meaning it's not a philosophy of being. It doesn't tell us who we are as human beings, but brain data tells us what our brains do. So especially in the case, I'll be speaking about this later, of fMRI, EEG, but also brain lesions to an extent. It tells us mechanisms behind political and social behavior. And because the data in itself doesn't tell us who we should be and what we should do, we need to think very carefully what political questions do we want from the brain? With what political questions do we approach the brain and the data that comes out of it as we examine it, because it won't tell us that automatically. And indeed, this is one of the objections that often comes up. People worry that a neuropolitical approach or neuro approach in general is deterministic and reductionistic. So this is something I want to make you aware of as you are starting your exciting neuroscientific careers. I believe that you will also encounter these kinds of objections and challenges, asking you to which degree and how insights into the brain can actually be incorporated into political thinking and argument. So this is something that I'll be speaking about in terms of epistemology. It's a philosophical and a practical question. And then about the social contract, this is quite an abstract idea. So I'm trained as a political scientist, but specifically as a political theorist and political philosopher. I wrote an interdisciplinary dissertation where I also had a social neuroscience advisor, and I work with neuroscientists also today. But basically, the social contract comes very much from my specific field, which is political philosophy. And the social contract is rather abstract. And this is something that people weren't really that fussed about, to be honest, over a decade ago. So as I was still in grad school developing these ideas, this was just shortly before Brexit happened, before the first Trump presidency happened. There was not a strong sense of catastrophe and breakdown. And I'll be speaking about this sense of thinking of politics through the lens of catastrophe and the brain as well, how this is something that is very pertinent now. And there's a lot of interest in neuropolitics. That's a good thing. But at the same time, in a way, when we should have been thinking about these questions before all hell broke loose, people were not really that concerned, because the social contract is really asking the most fundamental questions. It asks, how can we survive each other? So basically, the social contract is about the question how we can actually build society together. How can we build the rule of law? How can we build the modern state? What has to be in place for us to survive each other and to cooperate with each other? And a lot of that has been taken for granted, I would say, before 2015. And now, as unfortunately all of our democracies worldwide are in crisis mode and face anything from polarization to extremism to decline of democratic practice and an increase in aggression and violence. Of course, this question of how can we survive each other, how can we cooperate, basically what is the social contract and how can we pitch it successfully anew, is very much at the fore. And I'll be speaking about that, and I'll be speaking about my own neuropolitical theory of a social contract, where I center our cognitive capacities and vulnerabilities. So it's the talk is basically a mix between history, theory, and also my very personal, intellectual, interdisciplinary journey, in the hope that you, at the start of your careers, if you also are interested in incorporating your brain research in an interdisciplinary way, in the hope that you can draw inspiration from it, and I very much hope that we can discuss all of this during the Q&A that will be scheduled as well. Now, I'd like to start this talk with a quote. This quote is by a Norwegian writer, Karl Ove Knausgard, who witnessed an awake craniotomy, an awake brain surgery in Albania. And he wrote about it in a piece for the New York Times a couple of years ago. And it had a profound impact on him, watching that brain surgery. And the quote sums up very well what we'll be looking into today during this lecture. He wrote, "I had always considered my thoughts as something abstract, but they weren't. They were as material as the heart beating in my chest. All of our systems too, communism, capitalism, religion, science, they also originated in electrochemical currents flowing through this 3-pound lump of flesh encased in the skull." Now, I will leave that quote as it is and basically take it into my next slide, which is, how did I get to the brain reality? And actually, as I speak to neuroscientists, different ones, over the years, often a personal experience, whether that was somebody, a loved one having a brain tumor, or they themselves experiencing mental illness, brought them to brain science. Also in my case, a mental illness, I had PTSD when I was an undergrad, like maybe many of you. Young brains, you might be aware of the research of Sarah Jane Blakemore, her work on adolescent brains and how they process risk differently, and how the brain stays pretty plastic until your early 20s even. So you might appreciate this as you find yourselves in a brain moment in your lives where your brains are still volatile. And so this happened to me, and it was not treated for a long time. Treated only the third year, as I was about to graduate. This was back in the UK, in Cambridge, and I had cognitive behavioral therapy. And to me, this was absolutely mind-blowing and eye-opening, because I was a very intellectual German philosophical girl who believed that I could overcome and change anything through the power of my intellect alone. And that experience, both because, as you surely know, cognitive behavioral therapy is based on brain science, both that therapeutic experience, which cleared me of my symptoms in a very short amount of time, and realizing that there's this vulnerable organ underneath my skull, and that I could not control it just through pure thought alone. That was a really eye-opening experience for me, and really brought this visceral, sensual brain reality into my whole thinking, my political thinking, my philosophical thinking, my literary thinking, my artistic thinking about the world. And when I went to grad school to the US after that, I was very lucky that at the time Eric Kandel was at Columbia, and I was able to exchange with him as well about his interdisciplinary approach to brain science. And I was very moved by his story of having basically started, I think he did a PhD in literature at Harvard first, started, as this child of refugees from Vienna, Jewish refugees, and with a very psychoanalytic background, and then eventually really moving into a very microbiological level, studying memory in the brain. And I was very moved that this was possible, and that there was somebody who spoke about it in such a inspiring way. And also that somebody like Eric Kandel said, I will never forget that. He said, I'm trying to teach my students, my neuroscience students, I'm trying to teach them a kind of aesthetics of what is the right research question. So again, remember what I just said earlier, the data doesn't tell us what to do. We as neuropolitical philosophers and neuroscientists, we have to use our individual judgment in coming to the brain and asking it the most interesting questions. Another experience that brought me to this brain reality was my experience as an Asian minority woman in a field that was and still is largely very white and very male and very, very Western. And I could feel that my body, I could see that my body did not fit into the canon of Western political philosophy. And also it didn't fit into the ideas of what it meant to be human. And yet there I was sitting in a seminar room with my body, knowing very much that I was just as human as the people that we were reading and the people that we were imagining, often it wasn't Asian women, in our discussions. And I made another experience, which I call a kind of neuropolitical dissonance, which is I had professors, I knew political philosophers, political scientists, people who worked in NGOs who said beautiful things about human rights and diversity and inclusion. But when they spoke to me or others who did not fit actually into this idea of what it means to be human for them, they were dehumanizing me, for example. I had this experience, this dissonance of somebody can say beautiful things, morally beautiful things, and yet on an interpersonal level there was something else going on, and I will come back to that later in the context of social neuroscience and the civil rights movement. Something was going on and I couldn't put my finger to it, and I felt this has to be located in the brain. This has to be something probably subconscious that is going on, that is in dissonance to what is being said. And I was lucky that I was able to explore these things in what I have to credit the US for, which was a very open academic climate. And I think comparatively, I know that the US academia is going through multiple crises and assaults on funding and intellectual freedom, research freedom. But I want to say in an encouraging way that I still think there's something very unique about the US academic climate. I say this as coming from Europe. I say this having been in Asia and in Europe and globally seen different academic climates. And I could just shoot an email at the time to a very well-known social neuroscientist, Susan Fiske at Princeton. She was the first social psychologist to testify in a Supreme Court case on gender discrimination. And within an hour, an email came back and she pointed me to a student who by that time was already a professor at Duke, excuse me, and now is at UCL. Lazana Harris, who became my social neuroscience advisor, who studies dehumanization. And I was lucky in a way that I'm saying this to you also in an encouraging fashion. If you are ambitious undergrads or graduate students who are thinking about interdisciplinary work, don't be afraid to shoot that email, to give it a try, to connect with people outside of your field, because you might actually just establish lifelong connections and research collaborations. So I was lucky on that front. And now I'm working also with Ernst Pöppel in Germany, who does a lot of stuff on intercultural neuroscience and time conception. So this is something that also I'm lucky to find. You have to, when you work interdisciplinarily, you have to yourself find those who are like you, who are open to paradigm shifts, who are open to creating a new language that doesn't just mirror what is being done in their fields. Now, this is just a sense, sort of. This is very 90s, 2000s popular neuroscience. So people like Joseph Ledoux, who also is very interdisciplinary, self-professed Catholic. You surely know of him. Studies fear, has artists in residence in his lab. Antonio Damasio, also studying emotions in the brain, probably at that time very much the two of them very much helped to maybe even over popularize the amygdala amongst the general public, but also of course Eric Kandel's interdisciplinary books on how he got into neuroscience, and he indeed fled from Vienna. This is a book that just came out that I can recommend as great bedtime reading, which very much describes this interdisciplinary approach that I've just laid out to you, which is my approach, trying to think about large complex phenomena in this interdisciplinary way. And it sort of shows how Vienna was the birthplace of that at the beginning of the 20th century, the fin de siècle, and how that also spread with Viennese people going to the US, influenced the US massively in the 20th century, and still now through scientists, but also people going to Hollywood, to California, in the fine arts and so on. So it was a very eclectic approach, and it describes how some of the major scientists of the 20th century who were in Vienna were completely open to other fields and just finding that new language to describe the world. Now, let me start with the historical influences on me. When I was starting to think about the social contract, we were still within the field of political science, but also generally in the world as we understood ourselves, we were very much in a state of optimism. And the optimism was one where we believed that after the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the collapse of multiple authoritarian, totalitarian systems, liberalism was the only option left. Somebody called Francis Fukuyama, a well-known political scientist, wrote the book The End of History and the Last Man, borrowing from Hegel, this idea that basically we had reached the end of history. All other systems would slowly collapse, and the belief of them in them would also collapse. Margaret Thatcher famously said there is no alternative. The belief was there is no alternative to a liberal order, and that the free market and liberal values would be convincing in themselves and inevitable to bring that end of history about. And this approach also, this thinking very much influenced US foreign policies. And within the social and political sciences, it seems almost ridiculous now, but people were talking about the end of big wars. Now we're speaking about the possibility of World War III again. People were talking about the end of nationalism. Even the possibility that religions would end, because we're so much at that end of history. And I mention that because this thinking really has been very recent. And my argument is that one of the reasons why we are in such a crisis now, why we struggle to explain the developments in terms of right-wing populism, authoritarianism, extremism, the erosion of democratic practices, is because we don't really have an ideology or a perspective, an approach, a framework to explain this. Because the framework just before a lot of these developments that I just described surprised us was this, what I'm just presenting to you now. And underlying this was what the philosopher, Harvard philosopher Michael Rosen calls a rationalist idea of human nature. And in this, I will come back to this rationalist idea in the next slides. I apologize, I'm recording this in a way on PowerPoint that doesn't allow me to go back and forth with the slides, so I will try to just be disciplined and stay on one slide and do it one after the other. So this is just what I mentioned earlier. The world didn't turn out as Fukuyama expected, and many people around him expected. And I mention this also because one larger way of thinking will always influence other areas of thought. And so, for example, in terms of conspiracy theories, which now, there's a renewed interest in that, there's no new research in that, but actually at that time, there was very little research done by social psychologists on conspiracy theories, because the belief was that the free marketplace of ideas would basically get rid of them anyway, because people the rational human being would make the right choice and truth would prevail, so to speak. So the way how we look at the world, the larger zeitgeist, but also the larger worldview we have of how things are developing, how history is developing, influences science. It influences social psychology. It influences the questions we ask in social neuroscience. Of course, at that time, social neuroscience, in the 90s and 2000s was not was just in its infant shoes. But you get what I'm trying to say. So today in this talk, I want to also give you that big picture perspective, in that the questions that you ask of the brain are often influenced by the way we think about the world. And so it is important to critically look at how do we actually think about the world, and is that the right way? Now on this slide, I'm just listing up basically how the world did not turn out as we expected it to. And this is the rationalist idea of human nature. So political philosophers like Emile Rousseau and Immanuel Kant, Karl Marx, basically both on the more liberal end, Immanuel Kant, and then on the more leftist end, Karl Marx, they all had this idea of what Michael Rosen calls the rationalist idea. And the rationalist idea really is about, it has its roots, of course, in Enlightenment in great parts, but it is about this idea that truth and knowledge and education can make people realize what is good for them and realize what they should aspire to, and then naturally they will. And somebody like Rousseau, in the context of the social contract as well, he believed, well, what is the social contract? You know, we need to bring out the good in the human being. Human beings are naturally good, he believed, and society is what corrupts the individual. He believed in this idea of the noble savage. And Kant also believed that individuals, so this was a time, you have to understand, this was radical during the Enlightenment period, to believe that you did not need an authoritarian, you did not need an absolutist monarch, and you did not need an absolutist religion to tell you who you were and how you should think. This was absolutely radical. I mean, something that we kind of take for granted now was really hard fought for. And then also on the left side, Karl Marx, this idea, you know, why do the hungry not steal and why do the poor not rebel? And a Marxist would say, with this idea of false consciousness coined by Gramsci, they would say, well, the oppressed would rebel if only we would educate them about their position of rebellion. And if they would understand how oppressed they are, if they would finally understand, they would free themselves from their shackles. Now, I don't need to tell you, I'm sure you in your close vicinity, also people who you observe, political movements you observe, you can tell people the truth and they still don't do it. You can tell people, this policy is really detrimental to you. Why do you vote for that? Something that I'm really interested in, and something that I'm writing about, also my new German book, is immigrants who vote. In Germany we have the AfD, which is the far-right party, but also in the US, Trump got a lot of support from immigrants, even already starting in 2016 through 2020, and again in the last election. So this is a kind of paradox. And a Marxist would say, well, you know, they just don't know that they're oppressed. Let me tell them how they're oppressed, and then if they understand, they will make the right choice based on actually their social status. But people seem to make sometimes the opposite choice against their interest. They act against their interest, even though they know better. And so this is a phenomenon that the rationalist model cannot explain. But unfortunately, I have to say, this rationalist idea of the human being is very much prevalent, both in political science to an extent, in the social sciences to an extent, but certainly amongst politicians, especially liberal ones and on the left side, that's how they operate, based on this rationalist idea of human nature. And you can see that the best, especially, say, for example, in the context of Germany. The US is a little bit different because, you know, you did have the civil rights movement. There is definitely more race awareness. There's a proper race discourse. In Germany, you don't really have that. And this is something that Europe really lags behind. But if you ask a politician here, can children be racist? Generally, people on the left and on the liberal side would say no. They would say it's society, it's the systemic inequality that makes people racist, but children in themselves, they're good. Remember Rousseau? And really that boils down to this dichotomy between individual brain versus society. And I just bring this up because I think this is something, as neuroscientists, this is something that you will encounter again and again and again as you communicate your research, especially if it has a social component, to the wider world. Pay attention to this, because people often operate on either of the two sides, or really, which is, I think, the right approach, is to take both components, the individual brain and also, of course, the social and systemic influences into account. But this is something that you should keep in mind as you communicate. What does it actually mean to have an insight into the brain? And on this question whether children can be racist, well, unfortunately, in some ways, we have to say yes. So by 6 months, babies can differentiate between their own race and other race faces, and with a preference for their own race and skin color. Makes sense, right? Evolutionarily. You would prefer people who look like your mother, your father, your primary caregivers. By 9 months, the so-called other race effect has settled in, which is means that I struggle to differentiate, basically individualize people from an out group who doesn't look like me. So I find it easier to differentiate different faces in my in-group, people who do look like me. And you might have heard of this other race effect in racism debates, when people say, oh, Asians, you all look the same, or black people, I can't differentiate, you all look the same. This is the other race effect. And by age 5, I apologize that my video is over the slide and somehow I'm unable to move it, so I will just read it to you. So by age 5, something is settled in which is called infrahumanization, which is very much part of my research field on dehumanization and humanization, which means that people in my own in-group, people who I think are part of my identity group, I'm able to describe how they're feeling, their state of mind, with much more complex vocabulary than I would be able to describe somebody outside of that group. That's called infrahumanization. Now, I'd like to take a step back, and I promise it will all make sense at the end. I'm jumping around a little bit in this lecture because it is a very interdisciplinary approach, but I want to take a step back, and I want to look at the beginnings of social neuroscience to make you understand what is the instinct behind it. So few people know that actually social psychologists, so of course at that time we didn't have social neuroscience, in that we did not have fMRI technology, EEG and so on, but it's instinct. Again, it's that what I mentioned with Kandel, it's that judgment, it's that a certain aesthetic towards approaching this phenomenon that already arose at that time, and that I find incredibly inspiring and moving. So basically, in the context of the civil rights movement, it became increasingly clear to social psychologists even back then that public displays of racism would become taboo. And their instinct was to say, well, surely there is still discrimination going on, but if so, how can we still measure it? And so what they did was they conducted so-called sweat gland studies, where they had white people in a room and they had black people walk in on and off, not explaining anything about it, and just looking at how much white people, how they would react to it based on their sweat secretion. Because that to them was an implicit measure, it was an implicit indication of fear, of whether they would be more afraid if a black person walked in. And indeed, there was more sweat gland activity when a black person walked in. And I find this to be such an ingenious study because it uses something quite simple, such as sweat gland secretion, to detect something big. And this is also part of the instinct there, the aesthetics, the judgment, the search there for this new epistemology also goes concomitantly with the cognitive revolution in the 1970s, because there many different subjects, from linguistics to philosophy, anthropology, neurology, computer science, came together to ask what's actually in the brain, yes, and in this black box that is the brain. Now, in this epistemological approach, so how, what are the methods, what's the neuropolitical perspective on the world, I always speak about a neuropolitical spectrum. And I explain this actually in more detail in my first book, Vulnerable Minds, because a lot of confusion and a lot of resistance to brain data, I think, comes from a lack of understanding that we actually operate on what I call this neuropolitical spectrum. And mainly what is going on there, I don't think I need to explain this to you as neuroscientists, is that, of course, it starts at the cellular level. So whatever our brain does, there's a cellular activity, and that then we might be able to detect as a neurobiological mechanism. And then, of course, not to forget, there are hormonal influences, there's endocrine interplay, and all sorts of other influences. And then, maybe then we can detect, we can measure brain networks. And then out of the brain networks comes maybe a specific affect or a specific cognitive response. And then if you look at it politically, maybe out of that, then we can measure a kind of political attitude that somebody might have in response to something in the world. That can form into an opinion. Opinions that solidify can form into beliefs. And then if they solidify over time, they become political ideologies. And then maybe based on that, we can have somebody, motivated enough to act on it and then to exhibit a certain behavior that we can then describe and measure. And then finally, for political phenomena, what of course is important, a certain political act, whether that's voting or protesting or intergroup aggression or intergroup cooperation. So all of this, you can see, is very complicated. And we are just at the beginning to make the dots between the different stages of the neuropolitical spectrum. And of course, the most powerful study is one where we can show something going on at the neurobiological level and that how this causally affects a political act. This is, a gold standard or an aspiration. But that is very difficult, and I will speak about this later. It's not impossible, but there's a lot going on in between. And you will see that also what's going on in between is different methodologies. And there is contestation and even dispute between neuroscientists and psychologists because they use different methods. So I mean social and political neuroscientists and social and political psychologists, because the psychologists, of course, if you look at the bottom line, they mainly measure attitude, opinion, belief, ideology, behavior, things that where you use survey methods, where you use attitudinal measurements, where you use behavioral measurements. And they sometimes they can be critical of bringing in that top level, what you can't see. And indeed, one argument for neuropolitics is that it can reveal that top level. And the interesting thing is, going back to what I just mentioned, people saying beautiful things and yet their brains seeming on some level to be doing something else as well, in a dehumanizing way. That's exactly this dissonance that a social neuroscience and political neuroscience approach can capture, that a psychological approach alone would not be able to capture. And I think that within that lies its power. But I just wanted to make you aware of this spectrum, because sometimes the resistance that you get to brain data and to the brain approach is simply the resistance to that upper level, because you can't see it, and it is hard to establish causal, even correlative relationships between the top and the bottom. But for me, even just to acknowledge, as a political scientist, as a political philosopher, that this whole spectrum exists. Because often social scientists and political scientists and philosophers, they pretend as if only the last 3 or 4 levels that I mentioned here exist. To me, to acknowledge that that whole level exists is a game changer, and it's a paradigm change to how we view the world. Now, I just mentioned this noble beliefs and dehumanizing brains phenomenon. So we had in the history of philosophy, we had somebody like Immanuel Kant, whom I've also mentioned earlier, who an Enlightenment philosopher who by the end of his life was actually able to reject the slave trade and colonialism, which was raging at his time. He was able to reject it as a bad idea, but he still believed that blacks were subhuman, Untermenschen, he called them in German. Similarly, research that one of my colleagues at UVA is doing, Indian police officers who underwent a 1-year human rights training were able, after a year, to adopt human rights values and to speak beautifully about them, to link them to their local beliefs, to link them to Gandhi's thought, but they still believed that certain groups did not deserve this equal treatment, namely Muslims and Dalits in India, minority groups that are often the target of police violence. So you can see this sort of spanning through history, that people can have beautiful beliefs, but somehow are unable to translate that into proper humanization for everybody. Now, since we're speaking about the social contract, I want to briefly mention the social contract theorist who of the 17th century, one of the major ones of history, who actually does influence my work. And this person is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, very different to somebody like John Locke, who is more commonly taught in the US in political science in this context, who also had a much more positive idea of human nature. Thomas Hobbes doesn't have this positive view. I wouldn't say it's just negative either. I would say it's more neutral. And he famously described the so-called state of nature. So before we enter the social contract, before we have a civil state, before we have the rule of law, he said we are in a state of nature, and he described it famously as a nasty, brutish, and short. You might have heard of this. And he believed that really human beings, excuse me, he believed that human beings, if left to themselves, have susceptible cognitive capacities. I do believe he was a proto-cognitive thinker. He basically writes about the senses, he writes about human imagination in his book Leviathan. And he experienced how during the English Civil War and the religious wars, how people would literally kill each other over their religious beliefs. And he thought that the brain was very susceptible and vulnerable to all sorts of beliefs, and also false beliefs about the world and about other groups. And he viewed politics very much like my approach, from the viewpoint of catastrophe and breakdown. So in my case, I've always been very influenced both by my parents' experience in 20th century China, during the Cultural Revolution, during the Maoist years, but also my German upbringing, Germany having had obviously Nazism and fascism in the 20th century, and then also the GDR period, East Germany, having a socialist totalitarian state. That basically the liberal order, so Germany before Nazism had the Weimar Republic, which was liberal democratic, that this order is very fragile. It's not impossible. It's not impossible to maintain, but there's something fragile about it, because there's something about the cognitive conditions where we're coming together that we need to take into account. And that these cognitive conditions, as I will say in a second later in the talk, these cognitive conditions make it hard or harder than we thought it would be to maintain a liberal democratic order. And so Hobbes, I apologize that I keep rubbing my nose. I seem to have a bit of an allergy attack right now. I think maybe against dust, so apologies for my nose. Liberal politics for Hobbes, therefore, has to be created out of this catastrophe. And for him, it's not something natural, like as for Locke and Rousseau, but it is something artificial. But it's not a bad thing per se that something is artificial. It just means that we need to overcome something in us in order to create this. And we need to find a powerful way of persuading the minds of everybody in order to successfully persuade them. Now, one of the most basic cognitive conditions that need to be in place, this is basically what Hobbes was asking, what I'm asking, in order for us to have a stable liberal democratic order, is humanization. This is my argument. And the social neuroscience insights into dehumanization showed me that it is impossible to have a stable and flourishing social order without getting control over our dehumanizing capabilities, over our dehumanizing brain capabilities. And I show, all sorts of different pictures. Of course, I could have shown, unfortunately, endless ones from the last couple of years in world politics, but what you can see is like dehumanizing people as animals, dehumanizing people as numbers, stereotyping them. The bottom picture is from the prison abuses during the Iraq War in Abu Ghraib, and then that's actually a 2016 Trump election campaign poster where they compare refugees, Syrian refugees at that time, it was a hot topic at that time, to Skittles. And playing very much both with dehumanizing, obviously, human beings into Skittles, but also playing with brain vulnerabilities in terms of how people's understanding of probability and statistics. Basically, you shouldn't drive a car then if you're so afraid of, if you looked at the statistics of car accidents, road accidents, the possibility at the time of being struck by a terrorist would be much, much higher. But of course, this is not what they're playing on. So again, this is a brain vulnerability. Now, I argue that dehumanization is the biggest political disruptor because it is so much part of what Lazana Harris, whom I mentioned earlier, argues is part of our human flexible social cognition. It is really part of how our social brains work. And something that Susan Fiske actually said, which I find very helpful, is that our brains are efficient. Our brains are efficiency. If our brains are efficiency machines, or organs that it is an organ that tries to be very efficient. And stereotyping and dehumanization is part of that efficiency attempt. So it's categorizing people very quickly into friend and enemy, very quickly into a dehumanized outgroup. It's objectifying people, it's categorizing people because it's fast. And our brains usually try to assess reality and quickly come to a conclusion. And evolutionarily, this might have made sense, right? Like evolutionarily, we needed to quickly, we were operating in small social groups, and we needed to quickly decide, is this person a friend or an enemy? And so dehumanization both can be more subtle. It has to do with something called mentalization, the ability to imagine somebody's mind, imagine what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and dehumanization is basically dementalizing. So you actually are unable to, you're unwilling to, you're unable to put yourself into literally somebody else's brain. And that can be triggered by something like disgust. And I'll come back to that later. Blatant dehumanization is, as the name says, much more explicit. So this is about comparing people to animals, to apes. You might have seen this. We just had this recently again, actually, in the German AfD context, but I've seen it on the far right in Italy. I'm sure also in the US there are examples where immigrants are compared to apes, to like something subhuman, to animals who try to dirty society, who try to bring illness to society. During the COVID pandemic and anti-Asian racism, a lot of Asian people who had never been to China, they were equated to, you know, something dirty and contagious in the virus itself. And then blatant dehumanization also is related to putting people in a civilizationary hierarchy. So basically seeing yourself, your own in-group, your own humanized in-group as more evolved as the dehumanized out-group. And the consequences range very widely, and I'll speak about this. The consequences really affect how we look at refugee and welfare policies. It affects our judgments in the justice system. It affects how teachers treat students in education. It can lead to aggression, but it can also lead to moral disengagement and neglect. So basically a kind of silent aggression, something that, you know, is also terrible, really, in terms of exclusion, is if I neglect a group. If, for example, homeless people who are commonly dehumanized in many different societies, if I neglect them, I dehumanize them to the point that I don't even think about them when I debate, you know, the future of the city, of this community. And that is just as disastrous for these groups. Now, let me take a step back again. So in order to explain the dehumanization research that I'm going to show in the next slide, I need to explain briefly about the stereotype content model. So the stereotype content model is psychological, it's not a neuro model, but it's a psychological. They first basically devised this as a psychological model that Susan Fiske devised. And she wanted to find out, how do stereotypes actually work? Like, what are the universal dimensions along which we stereotype people? It's now been tested worldwide. It's been tested against economic inequality. They have some fascinating research. It's a really very big research field now, the stereotype content model. But basically what she found out was that cross-culturally, we stereotype people along two dimensions. One of them is human warmth, and one of them is human competence. So basically, anybody whom you came across today, your brain very quickly, remember, our brains are efficient when they stereotype, very quickly tries to determine, okay, how competent are they? How smart are they? You know, how capable are they? And then how much are they willing, that's the human warmth part, how much would they be willing to share their competence with me? How much, you know, what's that cooperation potential with them? And if you have the axis, you then basically have four quadrants. So you have people, for example, in the high competence, low human warmth quadrant, who, I mean, the right hand picture was tested in the US. You have Asians, you have Jewish people, you also have scientists, by the way. I'll get back to that in a second. So, you know, you often get this compliment as an Asian person, oh, you know, you're so efficient, you're so hyper efficient. But actually, often Asian people are then denied human warmth. They are denied human warmth, human individuality, and friendliness, basically, to share that competence. And one emotion that comes out of it then is envy. Another quadrant that we have here is if somebody is viewed as highly warm but low in competence. So these are often people with disabilities, the elderly, that are they're being seen in a pitiful way, because it's basically like saying, oh, I feel sorry for them, they're nice but they're really incompetent, which is of course not true in the case of people with disabilities and also the elderly, but this is a stereotype. And then we have, and this is where dehumanization comes in, then we have the so-called lowest of the low. So the people who are both seen as low in competence and low in warmth. In the US, these are welfare recipients, homeless, the poor. I think in another study, they also found out drug addicts. I think also feminists were close in that quadrant. And so Susan Fiske and then my advisor at the time, Lazana Harris, they did a study, and it's kind of the beauty of scientific studies. They didn't really expect this result, so they came across this almost by accident. They wanted to, with fMRIs, look at the brain regions that are basically activated during these 4 quadrants of the stereotype content model that I just described to you. And they found different sorts of brain regions in 3 quadrants, but in all 3 ones, the envy one that I just mentioned to you, and the pity one, and also the pride one, which is high in both, the medial prefrontal cortex was active, which makes sense because the medial prefrontal cortex, and this is connected to mentalizing. We need that all the time. When we have a social brain, we need this all the time. And they found out that, however, that this is the on the arrow shows the lowest of the low. So this is the quadrant of low competence, low warmth. That basically, in that case, the medial prefrontal cortex deactivated. And this was basically, just as a comparison, the people also looked at an object, an inanimate object like a chair. And also the medial prefrontal cortex didn't activate. And so basically you can sort of, suggest that when we dehumanize somebody, i.e. when our medial prefrontal cortex shuts down, it's almost akin to looking at a chair, because we don't engage with that dehumanized group. Our brain doesn't engage with crucial brain regions such as the medial prefrontal cortex. And so the medial prefrontal cortex and mentalizing, let me explain that briefly. That is a research field, also a fascinating research field, if any of you wants to go into that, where a core social brain capability comes into play. You might have heard of mentalizing in theory of mind before. It started indeed from the fields of primatology and developmental psychology and autism studies, famously by experts such as Simon Baron-Cohen at Cambridge and then Uta and Chris Frith. When they studied autism, they found out that basically mentalizing, i.e. the ability to imagine somebody's thoughts and feelings and dreams, any visions they might have for the future, basically to be able to put yourself into somebody's mind is something universal. So it was tested cross-culturally, it was even tested amongst hunter and gatherers, the Baka people. It's a very fundamental, some neuroscientists even say it's the most fundamental way of being human. So mentalizing is really a huge part of how our social brains operate. And it is not quite empathy, so this is important. I find the neuropolitical approach, also what it gives us is precision. So often when we speak about, inclusion and discrimination, we always use these big terms in an interchangeable way, but actually people who do study the neuroscience of empathy, such as Tanya Singer, and who are able, due to the brain science, to make fine gradations and distinctions, what it actually means. So empathy really meaning, okay, I feel somebody's pain and I want to alleviate that pain. That's very intense. Mentalizing is not quite that. So you do need So mentalizing needs to be in place for cognitive empathy to happen, but you can have mentalizing without having empathy. Let me give you an example. So, for example, even when you are conducting a business transaction, you need to be able to imagine what is your business partner thinking. Okay, so this is not empathy. It is the ability to think yourself into somebody else's mind, and that is already huge and important. But it is not quite feeling somebody's pain. Now, I could give a whole talk just about the neuroscience of empathy, but this is just, you can look into this further if you're interested in this yourself. So mentalizing, autistic people struggle with this. They're not completely incapable of mentalizing as adults. You can teach it to an extent, but often people on the autism spectrum, children by the age of 4, neurotypical people can mentalize and they struggle. So this is just another aspect of it. And my political argument is that if mentalizing is linked to the medial prefrontal cortex, which we now know it is also linked to the temporoparietal junction. Somebody whom you might have heard of, quite prominent younger neuroscientist, Rebecca Saxey at MIT, found that out. If mentalizing is so crucial, and if it kind of is linked to humanization because it has to do with medial prefrontal cortex activation, then my political argument is that we cannot overcome polarization and we cannot have a stable social contract if we are not able to mentalize the minds of people around us. I will come back to that argument in a second, but I'll let that stand there let that sink in. Now, blatant dehumanization, this is just an example for you. You can also look deeper into that if you're interested. This is the late Emile Bruno, with whom I also discussed many times about the political implications of dehumanization. He and his colleagues did some also global, cross-cultural, very impressive research, basically on showing people this so-called ascent of man, which is fictional graph that doesn't really make sense, but basically tries to see how much people believe in this. That some groups, you can see Canadians, Europeans, Muslims, some groups are they more evolved than others, and they tested this globally, and yes, this kind of belief, this civilizational hierarchy, very much exists. In the US, when they tested that, of course, Americans put themselves, as very evolved together with Canadians, and they put Asians, I think Koreans and Japanese somewhat evolved, and then Chinese not very evolved, and then I think at the bottom it was maybe Muslims and Arabs. And they were also able to use neuroscience methods, fMRI. So often you can see political social neuroscience starts in a way with psychology. So they look at attitudes, they look at beliefs, opinions, and then they see, okay, is there any ground for that also on the brain level? And so they found out, for example, that the brain regions involved in this blatant dehumanization, as I just described it, such as the inferior parietal cortex and the inferior frontal cortex, they are distinct to blatant dehumanization. And when they tested other ways of exclusion and discrimination, such as prejudice, which they define as disliking somebody, these brain regions did not light up. But other brain regions were involved. And the red light is actually for like, so the opposite of dislike, like the posterior cingulate cortex. And then they had, they tested also how people basically viewed, so they viewed these groups, they gave them the same groups, but asked them different questions according to blatant dehumanizations, dehumanization according to prejudice, and then also according to similarity to the self, where the MPFC was involved. So basically they're using fMRI methods, but they could have also used other methods, but fMRI is the most common one, and of course the results are only correlative in this case. They use that to even just to be able to distinguish, to say, oh wow, there are different kinds of exclusion, dehumanization, prejudice, whatever kind of stereotyping, implicit bias, but they present differently at the brain level. And to me, again, going back to the brain reality, this is important, because if we just looked at the attitudinal data, it might look the same. Or if we just looked at sort of layman psychology or layman, or political philosophy, judging all these different ways of exclusion, we would say, well, why is prejudice, why is the dehumanization worse than prejudice? Why would, surely they're the same, or morally, I think, prejudice should be worse. But really what they showed is that, so they did a study also in the real world, for example, on Hungarian teachers, and they showed that the discrimination that Hungarian teachers exhibited towards Roma student, a minority in Hungarian society, if they dehumanize them, they would be much more likely to send them to a basically lower grade school than if they just disliked them. So blatant dehumanization, i.e. believing that somebody was civilizationally inferior to your own in-group, had both a much bigger behavioral effect, and they also would argue sort of at the brain level there's a more significant effect, and that at the brain level really it's distinct from prejudice. So this is sort of where the neuropolitical epistemology, I think, is powerful, because we are able to say with more accuracy and with more distinction what kind of discriminations matter. And from my field, if I looked at the literature in political philosophy and political science, even like the quantitative data that political science produce about discrimination, and then the conclusions they draw from it, so much of it is subjective speculation. So, even great political philosophers like John Rawls, for example, who in this kind of liberal, optimistic historical context that I just mentioned earlier, he was very much read in that context. He had extremely subjective ideas of what kind of exclusion is good or bad. And so for me to be able to say, well, yes, it's not nice to exhibit prejudice, but it's not nice, to exhibit envy, stereotyping. But really, if your MPFC shuts down and you're not able to mentalize anymore, and you are viewing that certain outgroup like a chair or a table, and whatever consequences come out of that, whether it makes it easier for you to torture them because they're just like an inanimate object, or it makes it easier for you to neglect them during discussion of welfare policies, that to me is a game changer. I think it's a paradigm shift, and it's powerful. And when I indeed explain that now to large audiences, or to people who want to change society, or to people who are concerned, to people who themselves have been victims of discrimination, that is an eye-opener. That's a way to be able to talk about it, to bring in a reality that beforehand has just been that black box. And to me, it is, as somebody who believes in this Viennese interdisciplinary approach, if you'd like, it is also somewhere our scientific responsibility to not ignore this level of reality that you, as young neuroscientists, are studying, that is so clearly there. It is not responsible, but it is also just again, going back to Kandel's aesthetic, it is from a judgment viewpoint. It's not the right thing to do. It's not what we should ultimately aim at if we want to understand the world. Somehow this slide is coming up again. I apologize. Okay, so these are behavioral outcomes coming out of dehumanization. So there have been studies basically linking the social psychology and the social neuroscience insights into dehumanization with actual outcomes. So I've just spoke about the education aspect, the Hungarian teachers. We also know that in the justice system now, that if you describe defendants in a dehumanizing way, if you basically trigger disgust, if you trigger the insula, so to speak, at the brain level, if you describe them in an animalistic way, defendants, there will be more severe punishments. This changes the way how we look at defendants. Dehumanization is powerful. Then a Norwegian study showed that media portrayals of Roma refugees who were triggering disgust, so basically saying, you know, they're dirty, they're full of illnesses and so on, that this would also affect people's decreased support for including them. And welfare refugee policies that would be inclusive, so basically wanting to deport them. And this was quite a big study at the time, this Norwegian study, because it for the first time linked insights, brain insights, with to real world events and to real world effects. Another of my colleagues, Sophie Travalter at UVA, back then when I was at UVA, she actually just came out with that study on superhumanization. So this is another kind of dehumanization that at first, at face value, might first seem positive. So medical students and personnel, I believe, at UVA actually they found out a lot of superhumanizing beliefs about Black people, such as that their skin was different, their skull was thicker, their blood coagulated differently. Of course, you know, you could probably explain that going back to slavery and all sorts of, you know, ideas that were conjured up about Black people as humanly different, biologically different, even though of course they are not. But these superhumanizing beliefs, which you could at face value say, you know, Black people being seen as super athletic or as physically stronger, first comes across a bit like a compliment, right? Just as when Asians are being told, oh, you're just so hyper efficient, like a machine, you're so excellent academically. So this actually led to something disastrous, which is a denial of pain to Black patients, and therefore a denial of sufficient pain medication. And at the time, actually this coincided also with first wave of Black Lives Matter protest in 2015, you could really draw clear comparisons with Darren Wilson, who shot Michael Brown, the police officer, how he describes him as demonic and sort of a Hulk that was larger than life. And you can see in a way why he then would shoot him so many times excessively in the back, because if you believe that his body, that his Black body is so different to the point that he takes pain differently, then of course you would treat that body with much less care and much more aggression. So in that case, superhumanization, another form of dehumanization, can also lead to real world concerning outcomes. And also in mental health care settings for Asians, this kind of what I just described is called mechanistic dehumanization, Asians often being seen as sort of hyper-efficient machines. That can also lead to denial of pain in mental health care, settings. Now, I argue that in the social contract context, that upholding the liberal brain is one of the biggest challenges of our time. Going back to Hobbes, I believe that basically, based on the social neuroscience research and the political neuroscience research that we have today, these are both relatively young fields, so only a couple of decades old. And when I started to work on it, really very young, political neuroscience was very young at the time. My conclusion that I draw is that the world that we live in, both in terms of the anxieties, the uncertainties, the uncertainty about the future, in terms of the economy, in terms of climate change, in terms of, kind of globalized crisis state, that's a challenge to our brains. And the liberal brain, which is being tolerant of other groups, having basically to humanize, to mentalize a vast array of groups. I call it hyperdiverse, in a hyperdiverse society that we live in, a vast array of groups that you have to mentalize on a new basis, often daily, because group boundaries shift, people move, the way how we cooperate globally across nation borders, across identities, shifts all the time. That is a challenge to our brain. And liberals are self-reportedly more miserable than conservatives. Conservatives are self-reportedly happier. So the liberal brain doesn't feel good. And so what I argue, is we need to pitch this social contract anew, where we, in a honest and realistic way, tell people, well, listen, humanizing others, dealing with uncertainty, is not going to feel good all the time. In fact, it might feel really uncomfortable. And this is something that Hobbes, in a way, was already hinting at. But it is in our shared interest to pursue this nonetheless, because this is still, the liberal democratic system is still the system where each of us as individuals can live out our individual selves in the most autonomous, free way possible, and where there is still the most freedom and justice and equality served than if we lived under a right-wing authoritarian regime. This is the pitch on which the future of our times hinges. But the pitch needs to be made in a way that it needs to be made in a realistic way. You can't tell people, well, we're all not born in any discriminatory, racist way. Our brains, you're all good, and it's just the system that's bad. If we change the system, we all change. This is, to me, in a way, the lie that has been told complacently and irresponsibly for decades, and the political mess that we're in, and the crisis that we're in, and the ideological, the lack of ideological resistance and ideas that we have against the current authoritarian backlash comes from a lack of understanding the human brain. This is, I tell people, neuropolitics is not about a fetishization of the brain, because there's also that going on. I mean, this is something, maybe because I'm a very serious, German, philosopher, that's sort of in my bones, that's how I've started. I've never used neuroscience as a pop, as a pop science just to put on top of my theory. I always thought we need to think from the brain cell. We need to think cognitively upwards. We need to first just understand unideologically who are we in our brains. And then from there we need to decide, well, and who do we want to be politically? This is indeed the pitch that I make in Vulnerable Minds in my first chapter in Charlottesville to a pro-Trump supporter in 2016. Some of you got the book in the raffle, so you can read that in chapter 1. This is the pitch that I make, that basically we have to decide what kind of political society we want to live in. The brain does not decide that for us. And then we have to see what kind of brains we need to get there, and how we can get our brains there, because our brains can go many different directions, as we have even seen just in the 20th century in terms of behavior and the different extreme political systems that existed. This is the honest pitch that we have to make to people. This is the honest education, enlightenment we have to bring to people. And the brain science is not brought in as a kind of cool, saying, oh, the amygdala rocks, or emotions are everything. I really don't like these kinds of approaches. The brain is being brought in as an integral part of what it means to be human in the world. And not just as a fancy addition to a theory. Now, I just mentioned, Charlottesville. indeed, I found at the time, in 2016, when I was still in the US, and even now in the work that I do in Germany with people on the right and across the spectrum, is that when you bring in that brain perspective, that's a powerful way to get into the heads of people who are more on the right or who are skeptical. Because they feel when I say, we all have dehumanizing brains. It's not just that they're the good ones on the left and you are the bad ones, but we all have dehumanizing brains. It's the truth. All of you, before you watch the talk, you've dehumanized somebody today because of your flexible social cognition. You cannot possibly have humanized everybody that you have come across today. You'd be lying on the floor. You wouldn't be watching this talk. Same for me. So to take kind of shame out of that and then to say, hey, we have still something in common. We have a universal basis, despite our political differences, where we actually can still talk about what it means to be human and what we need. And that is the brain, and that is how our brains function. And yes, they function differently based on, what kind of politics we choose. But there is a chance for us to still understand, mentalize each other. I think that is really, really important and powerful. And the research also shows when people see themselves, when people feel humanized, they are more conspiracy theorists, your opponents, when they feel you humanize them and you don't just, call them bigots, deplorables, crazies, uneducated, when you feel that you're being mentalized, and we know how that feels like, right? We feel, wow, I mean, that's some kind of door that has been opened. There's some kind of entryway of debate. We might still not agree on everything politically, but there's a way how we can at least start a conversation. And indeed, if we go back to the blatant dehumanization research, something that Bruno and his colleagues did was also to look at what happens when people feel dehumanized. And they call this meta-dehumanization. And they showed powerfully that they've showed this in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They showed this in various other intractable enmities and conflicts worldwide, that when we feel the other group dehumanizes us, that we will be much less likely, much less willing to agree to a peaceful solution or to debate with them, discussion, or any kind of cooperation, versus if we just feel disliked by them, for example. And that to me just shows again the power of this dehumanization concept, which lies at the heart of my social contract, humanization and dehumanization, because we also do live in a time where people they don't it's a bit like after the civil rights movement, people don't really admit to being racist or sexist or homophobic or exclusionary. Even on the far right, they call themselves ethno-nationalists, patriots. They wouldn't, this label racist is not even that effective anymore. And so in light of this dehumanization, for me, in my political analysis of conflict and of polarization, has been such a powerful tool to still point to exclusion and discrimination that's going on without, and make people even admit it to an extent, without using those labels that very few people actually self-identify with, even though it might still, of course, be going on in their brains. Now, a couple of words on political neuroscience. So this, I could give a whole talk about this. And I know a lot of people are interested in this. Unfortunately, I'm already running out of time, but I will briefly tell you about it, and you can also, based on some of the literature that I've mentioned, you can read about it. So this is a piece by Hibbing in 2014. He's a political scientist with whom I've also discussed publicly on this topic. They wrote a very controversial piece at the time, but it's absolutely worth reading, claiming that conservatives have a so-called negativity bias. And they claimed that based on various different research that has come out on basically how conservative people prefer so-called cognitive closure. They struggle with open time horizons, with open liberal time horizons. They struggle with ambiguity. There's the famous Kanai study that showed that self-professed liberals have literally more brain mass in their anterior cingulate cortex, which many of you might know is a brain area involved in ambiguity and also making judgments about ambiguous situations. And so liberals basically are more comfortable with ambiguity. Conservatives, they prefer less complexity, even the fact that they prefer, poetry that rhymes versus liberals who are more open to abstract art and also nonconformist poetry. Conservatives are less open to new experiences, and basically Hibbing and his colleagues said there is a kind of bias there which tends towards threat, which is very security sensitive, and there's basically a whole picture that emerges, so to speak, of a conservative way of accessing and a conservative preference of experiencing the world. And they mention also in this context how political behavior and decisions are so susceptible to environments. So of course conservatives are also in that sense susceptible. So they showed that they described how, for example, if you put a polling station in a church versus a school, people will vote more conservative if you put it in a church, probably implicit biases and activations there of religious values. If you sit somebody on a hard chair versus a soft chair, they will espouse more homophobic views if you put them on a hard chair, like that kind of stuff they discussed in this article. And there's a lot to say about how much one can deduce from this, and really if conservatives are like that. But this is sort of just to explain to you, this is what is happening in the field of political neuroscience. And something that I have argued with Florence Gaub, it actually, I think, is just coming out tomorrow in the New Scientist, which is that our brains struggle with an open-ended liberal time frame. And Florence Gaub, she is the research director at the NATO College in Rome. So this is just to mention, she is basically a political scientist, and I'm also a neuropolitical theorist. But we got this piece published now. We had interest there from the New Scientist, which you might know is a popular science magazine from the UK, but distributed worldwide, and it's read widely by lay people who are just interested in science. So for me, this is a win for neuropolitics, and also a bit of a encouraging thing to mention for you. How do you communicate the brain reality to a wider audience that is interested in science? And I think there's a real moment right now that that is very different to when I started my research on this, when I started to develop my theory and my whole approach and this sort of paradigm shift that I want to bring about, how people look at politics from the brain perspective. Hopefully, I think there's a real moment here. Where even popular science publications and people who might have some time ago found neuropolitics to be a niche subject, they're open to this brain reality that I talked about, because I think there's a real yearning for a different way of looking at the world, and a real realization that the ideologies that we had beforehand about politics and about human nature do not hold. And certainly they do not help us in solving our crises right now. I've just mentioned the anterior cingulate cortex study. There's another study, a more recent study done by bigger names in the political neuroscience field, Van Bavel and Joost at NYU, you might have heard of them. So they used a brain lesion study, which is exciting because with a brain lesion study, basically somebody having damage to certain parts of their brains, you can make causal inferences and not just correlative inferences. And indeed, this is also a way how the field is evolving, because this is a huge untapped potential, getting people involved who have brain lesions. And basically, so what they were able to show was that people who had greater damage in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, they exhibited more conservatism. And just incidentally, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, they are also implicated in the regulation of racism. So the study that I mentioned there is it's called the neuroscience of race. So of course there's also a whole subfield on the neuroscience of racism, different brain areas that are involved there. Obviously the amygdala, threat, fear, insula, disgust, and a couple of others, fusiform face area, detecting other race faces within milliseconds and so on. But basically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex are important in racism because they help us to regulate racist reactions, because we all have racist reactions. And so this is something else that I also say, which is like a paradigm shift for me. Often moral philosophers and political philosophers, they say to me, well, we wish that our brains wouldn't even be racist in the first place. Or they say, well, if you tell people that we all have racist brains, are you not giving people a way out? And it never struck me like this. Like, just if you told me now I have a racist brain, why should I see this as a way out? It just means, it means you're telling me, okay, I have two legs, and how far do you want to run? So yes, you just because your brain can do certain things doesn't mean that you can't try to regulate it, right? Just because I can potentially kill somebody in my outgroup out of evolutionary reasons doesn't mean that I should do it. So for me, just understanding that our brains are all potentially racist, but also then, of course, understanding with it that there are regulatory mechanisms involved, that's a given. I mean, it's a given because, again, liberal politics is artificial. It's not natural in the sense of I'm born the way I am, and sort of the most natural state is the most desirable political state. I think this is where so many problems enter, because in political thinking, and this is where the brain perspective is important, and neuroplasticity, and just simply a certain neuroautonomy. We know that people up until in their old age can still change many of their brain habits and so on. People can, like London taxi drivers, the famous study, they can grow, literally more brain volume in the hippocampus just by training for their taxi test. I mean, we know all of that. Why would the fact that my brain does something naturally mean that I need to end there? Why would that mean that? I really reject that view. And I think a neuropolitics of responsibility and solidarity rejects that view. We have to still decide where we want to be politically. Yes. This is somebody in the context of political neuroscience who I mentioned. This book just came out this year. Also, one of my colleagues, Liya Yu at Cambridge, who has had a lot of publicity and support and funding. This is sort of the success of political neuroscience. I can't go too deeply into her work, I'm afraid here. She studies the extremist brain, the ideological brain. If I had to sum it up in a nutshell, basically, the problem with a highly ideological brain is that it's a rigid brain. So there's a high level of cognitive rigidity when people believe in ideologies, whether that's left or right. And she's looking into ways to sort of loosen up that rigidity. And I just mentioned that because this is a popular science book that she wrote this year, and that's research you can look into. That's sort of successful, cutting-edge political neuroscience research that's happening right now. So really, to take a step back, and I will finish very soon. We have only a couple of slides left. What we are observing is currently a dissonance between the values that liberal democracy demands of our brains and what our brains actually do, and the lack of strategies, neuropolitical, cognitive, neuroaffective strategies, whatever, to get there, because there's simply a lack of knowledge. How do our brains function? Remember, I talked about brain mechanism, not ontology, not what our brains are, who they are, but how do they actually function when they view other groups, when they cooperate, when they are in a fight with somebody, when we feel polarized, when we feel highly extreme. How do they actually function? How can we get them to include, to cooperate, to humanize, to mentalize? To me, the neuro part in neuropolitics is simply understanding the mechanisms behind it and using the studies that I just described to you to devise more effective interventions where we know that basically moralizing and shaming strategies that have been employed by the left, and I say this as somebody very much coming from that tradition, have been used unsuccessfully, as we can see with election results, as we can see with people's views, to actually make people adhere to these liberal democratic values of equality and inclusion and so on. So the current strategies do not work. And so what I'm appealing to is a new set of strategies to actually make that work. And yeah, the political brain reality looks very different to the human being that has been conjured up, the image of the human being that has been conjured up in political and social theories of the last couple of centuries. And really, it is a challenge then of persuasion. I argue that we need a new neuropolitical language that is sensitive to how our brains work, and that we're talking to the brain here. We're not just talking to some subjective fantasy idea of who we are as human beings, what our brains do as human beings. We need a language that actually arrives in the brains of people. And mentalizing, of course, is important. Mutual destruction and the state of nature as a deterrent is also important, to remind people, and this is what worked in Charlottesville back then when I was teaching a very divided classroom, to say to people, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is the state of nature, life being brutish, nasty, and short. Do you want that? And if you don't want that, then maybe you have to take a step towards your enemy from both sides. You have to live with people that, you wouldn't necessarily like to have dinner with, but that's okay. You need to have the tolerance, this kind of, Hobbesian tolerance coming out of the English Civil War. You have to have a tolerance also of letting other views exist other than your own. And this is, again, also my argument, my pitch, my neuropolitical pitch against things like cancel culture. Now, these are, and this is how I'm closing now, these are some ways, I think, successful ways in which neuropolitics, which I never would have thought would make it into politics, have entered German politics. So I gave the keynote at the time last year on how to devise event planning, big events in Berlin as the capital. Anything from the Berlinale to Lollapalooza to conferences to literature festivals to anything that's being organized as like a mass event. And I brought in a neuropolitical perspective, how important humanizing is in Germany, also the fear of terrorist threats, how can that be dispelled? What can you do against it? How can you use a mass event as a way for people to come together, as one of the few moments in an urban space where people from very different groups actually meet each other and could potentially humanize each other. So all of that became part of this white paper, which now is being tabled at the Berliner Senate. So for me, this is, a cause for celebration that something so niche, only a couple of years ago in neuropolitics, can enter the mainstream discourse. Another way, the work that I'm doing here in Berlin is related to architecture and city planning. So these are different foundations and national organizations of German architects and city planners. And so I brought in a neuropolitical perspective, speaking about, of course, humanizing city planning, architecture, where basically the brain perspective is it's not so important to focus on the content of how we bring people together, but creating humanizing, cognitive humanizing spaces where people literally, we know, if cognitively, if I give you my attention, if I spend 30 minutes with a group that I usually wouldn't interact with, you already sort of have one half of the game. You've won my brain. To completely look at it differently, not to necessarily think, oh, people, groups need to come together and have an argument and agree on something. No, they might even be working on something like a communal garden. And then I spoke also about, this is something that I'm interested in right now, the neuroscience of awe. And how basically awe-inspiring structures, including nature, also in the context of the climate crisis, can help people be aware of who they are in the universe, on Earth, and other than different to moralizing discourses, that awe-inspiring structures where people come together and where people revise, their brains literally fall apart and rebuild again their sense of self due to this experience of spatial awe, how that can also be a powerful neuropolitical approach to changing people's views. I do school workshops in Berlin where the neuropolitical approach, what's different there is, I don't go in and tell people, well, racism is bad and, you should be nicer to your classmates. But I do kind of workshops where we redraw in-group boundaries, because we know that, again, it just takes a short time period, and especially for people to, be in a new in-group and identify with it, and especially when they feel there's like a common goal, there's a shared resource that's at stake. This is something also in my neuropolitical argument, that in this pitch we need to appeal to people's common interests. Our brains are, of course, very reward driven, and in a moralizing approach, this is not featured enough. And then I'm mentioning this because Professor O'Hare from Weber State, I believe, was at the talk as well, and I've been invited. I'm very honored to have been invited at Weber State University. It's a joint invite by Neuroscience and Political Science to speak next year. And of course, I had to think of this in the context of the Charlie Kirk shooting, because it's just around the corner. And the talk will be about what's happening in the brain of our opponent, and how neuropolitics can also be a way, in the wake of Charlie Kirk, to speak about political debate and what kind of brains we should cultivate also on campus, so that it does not end in violence. This is the German book that I'm working on right now, that will come out next year. I just bring this up sort of, this is a challenge for me. This is a popular science book. It's not like my first book, which was a bit more academic, but how do you really pitch something? And I'm trying to do this really very much in the German European context. Like, how do you pitch the neuropolitical argument in a national discourse? So I say this, I just bring this up as a possibility, something that can be done today. And there's been a lot of interest in this book. Also, in German media, I've already discussed my ideas a lot. I've gotten feedback from a very wide array of people in the population, from conspiracy theorists to refugees to anything in between, and they really respond to this neuropolitical approach. So I bring this up as a glimmer of hope, that I think now is the moment to make an argument from the viewpoint of the brain.